Please note, if you need your books be converted to audiobooks, then please contact us at email given in the description of this video. Also, please do not forget to subscribe to our channel. Lost Islamic History audiobook by Firas-Alkhateeb, Chapter 6, Part 2. Politically and militarily, not much progress was made against the Crusaders in the decades after their capture of Jerusalem in 1099. The Muslim world was far too weak and fractured to mount much resistance. When the challenge to the Crusaders finally appeared in the mid-1100s, it was not from the traditional centers of power in Baghdad, Damascus or Cairo. Instead, it came from a Turkish emir, Imad al-Din Zengi, who ruled over the city of Mosul in northern Iraq. A resilient and somewhat harsh leader, he managed to unite Mosul and Aleppo into one state. With the combined power of two of the largest cities in the region, his army conquered the county of Edessa, the northernmost Crusader state, in 1044. At the time, the conquest of Edessa did not mean much politically. It was by far the weakest Crusader state, and its loss did not affect the other three much, but looking back, 1044 was when the tide began to turn against the Crusaders and in favor of the Muslims. Zengi had hoped to forge a united Syria in the face of the Crusader threat by bringing Damascus under his control, but the former imperial city remained out of his grasp. Petty warfare among Turkish emirs was not over yet, and the emir of Damascus could not stand to give up his domain, even in the name of Muslim unity. When Imad al-Din Zengi died in 1146, his son Nuruddin Zengi picked up the struggle to unify the Middle East. The younger Zengi managed to conquer most of the territory around Antioch in 1149 and in 1154. He overthrew the emir of Damascus with the help of the local population who had grown sick of Damascus' alliance with the Crusader states. With Syria unified under the Zengi dynasty, it would seem that the liberation of Jerusalem and the rest of the occupied land was on the horizon. But a bizarre and unexpected series of events brought Nuruddin's attention to Egypt and the declining Fatimid Empire. With Syria unified and stronger than it had been since the demise of the Great Seljuk Empire, the Crusaders had to look south if they wanted to expand their realm. That meant invading into the ancient and fertile land of Egypt. In 1163, the king of Jerusalem led an invasion of Fatimid Egypt under the pretext of Fatimid refusal to pay tribute. To counter this invasion, the Fatimid Grand Vizier, Shawar, who had been overthrown by rival court forces just before the invasion, appealed to Nuruddin Zengi for military aid, lest the Crusaders manage to conquer Egypt. Despite misgivings about the expedition, Zengi sent an army to Egypt in the name of Muslim unity to fight the Crusaders and reinstate Shawar in 1164. After successfully defeating the Crusaders, Shawar was again made Grand Vizier, and it seemed an alliance between Shia Egypt and Sunni Syria would soon crush the kingdom of Jerusalem between them. But as soon as Shawar regained power, he changed sides, signing an alliance with the same Crusaders he had just fought against in an attempt to dislodge the Zengi army from Egypt. Zengi's army was forced to retreat to Syria, and a combined Fatimid Crusader force held Egypt. Just 4 years later, however, the Crusaders again invaded Egypt, hoping to annex the area once and for all. Once again, Nuruddin was called upon in the name of Sunni Shia unity to protect Egypt. And once again, the Zengi army arrived along the banks of the river Nile. This time, however, Zengi's army was not to be crossed by Shawar again. This military expedition defeated the Crusader army, and then Shawar, who was executed for his repeated treachery. The Fatimid Empire itself was not officially abolished, although it was brought under Zengi suzerainty, with Zengi's top general, Shirkuh, being appointed vizier in Shawar's place. After just 2 months as vizier, however, Shirkuh died of intestinal illness, and control of Egypt fell to his nephew, a young man with the given name Yusuf, but whom history knows as Saladin. Liberation of Jerusalem. Saladin seems to have been relatively disinterested in politics and warfare. Raised in Damascus, he studied traditional Islamic sciences under some of the greatest scholars of his era. He was staunchly Sunni, following the Shafi'i school of fiqh and the Ash'ari school of theology. It even seems he was more interested in a life of scholarship and religious studies than government. But his uncle's insistence that he accompany the Egyptian expedition altered the destiny of the young Saladin. When he inherited his uncle's position as vizier of Egypt in 1169, his religious leanings greatly influenced his policies. The heterodox Fatimid Empire, which had been a thorn in Sunni Islam's side for centuries, was officially abolished on Saladin's orders. The Al-Azhar University, once a bastion of Ismaili propaganda, was converted into a traditional Sunni school, and it remains so today. The general population of Egypt, which had never fully embraced Shiaism, welcomed Saladin's reforms and a closer relationship with Syria. But one person who did not welcome the growing influence and power of Saladin was Nuruddin, his nominal master in Syria. Nuruddin feared the growing influence of his governor of Egypt, and tension between the two was clearly very high. Many in Egypt and Syria believed war between Zengi and Saladin was inevitable. However, the two never fought. Zengi died in 1174 from disease, and Saladin was able to march into Syria unopposed and with broad public support. He was now his own sovereign, with Egypt and Syria united for the first time since the Fatimid uprising under his authority. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was now surrounded by a powerful, united Muslim state under a ruler who believed it was his religious duty to liberate the city of Jerusalem. Further compounding their problems, unity among the Crusaders was at an all-time low. Organizations such as the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller regularly undermined the authority of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In the 1170s and 1180s, as the Muslim world was united while the Crusaders were quarreling among themselves. It was the exact opposite of the situation in 1099. Nonetheless, Saladin was not eager to go to war. He signed peace treaties with the Kingdom of Jerusalem while he secured his domain from external and internal threats. His biggest problem was probably a secretive cult known as the Hashashin, an extremist group of Ismailiyas who believed the Fatimids had failed to bring a promised Shia revolution. Instead, they resorted to political assassinations and terrorism to bring the Sunni world to heel. Saladin never managed to fully eliminate the Hashashin threat, but his conflict with them preoccupied him politically and led to at least 2 assassination attempts by Hashashin agents. Saladin was forced to bring his focus back to the Crusaders in the mid-1180s after repeated provocations by a hawkish knight, Reinald de Chatillon, who had broken numerous peace treaties, massacred a Muslim pilgrimage caravan, and even attempted to attack Mecca itself. The Kingdom of Jerusalem became involved in the conflict, leading to the final confrontation between the united Muslim forces of Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. At the Battle of Hattin in 1187, Saladin's army completely routed the Crusader army of Jerusalem. Only a few knights were left in the Holy City, which capitulated to Saladin in October of that year. 88 years earlier, Crusaders had stormed into the city, massacring its population and subjecting its religious sites to Christian domination. Saladin, keen to follow in the footsteps of the Caliph Umar who had first conquered the city in 637, did not cleanse the Crusader occupation with another massacre. All the occupants of the city were given safe passage to Christian lands and were allowed to take their belongings with them. Christian sites in the city were protected and pilgrimage to them allowed. Saladin's noble behavior was not lost on the defeated Christians. Legends of his chivalry soon spread throughout Europe, and subsequent conflicts fought between Saladin and Crusader kings, notably Richard the Lionheart, are filled with stories of mutual respect between Muslims and Christians. Saladin's domain evolved into the Ayyubid dynasty after his death. His descendants continued to control Syria and Egypt for decades, even as more Crusader armies arrived at their shores to attempt to regain Jerusalem. The Crusades stretched on for over 100 more years after the liberation of Jerusalem, but they never again became a major threat to the Muslim world or its control over the Holy Land. Instead, A new threat was brewing that would trump the Crusades in size and scope. Just 20 years after Saladin's liberation of Jerusalem, a warlord known as Genghis Khan managed to unite the various Mongol tribes north of China into one state with a goal of constant military expansion. Although he was 5,000 kilometers away from the heart of the Muslim world, the expansion inaugurated by Genghis Khan would soon threaten the entire existence of Islam as a political force. The Mongols. Ironically, the Mongol invasion occurred when the Muslim world seemed primed for a comeback. The Fatimids were no more, and radical Shia revolutionaries only existed in small pockets throughout Persia and Syria. The Crusaders still held some coastal territory in Syria and Palestine, but were not a great threat to the sanctity of Muslim lands. The Byzantines still were incapable of recouping their losses from Manzikert, and were dealing with problems caused by Crusaders who seemed more intent on fighting fellow Christians in Constantinople than Muslims in Jerusalem. Yet the stability of the early 1200s was short-lived. Genghis Khan and the Mongols had gone from a tribal nuisance north of the Great Wall of China to a major world empire in a matter of a few years. Within 10 years of coming to power, the nomadic Mongols managed to conquer and hold the entire northern half of China. Genghis Khan's attention then turned westward, where the Karakitan Khante of Central Asia stood in the way of Mongol domination of Asia. Central Asia's plains were similar to the landscape the Mongols hailed from, and the conquest of this vast region was quick and severe. By 1219, Genghis Khan ruled a land empire that stretched from Korea to the borders of the Muslim world in Persia. The sudden explosion of the Mongols in the early 1200s is one of the most remarkable examples of military expansion in world history. The Mongols were nomadic horsemen who had not even mastered agriculture, but built a world empire that stretched from Central Europe to Korea to the borders of India. It was their nature as nomadic horsemen that made them capable of such conquests. The Mongols practically lived on horseback, and thus long distances and roadless terrain that deterred conventional armies were no barrier at all. In addition to their impressive speed, the Mongols employed a deliberate campaign aimed at instilling great terror in the hearts of their enemies, to the extent that they would voluntarily lay down arms rather than defend their homelands. When the Mongols arrived at an enemy city, the defending garrison was given three options. The first option was to avoid fighting, capitulate to the Mongols, and join the Mongol army in their continued campaign of conquest. The second option was resistance. If the city resisted the Mongols and lost, its entire garrison would be put to the sword and the city looted. The third option involved mass resistance to the Mongols by both the city's armed garrison and civilians. If that occurred, the Mongols promised to kill every single soul inside the city, a fate that numerous towns and cities across Asia faced. With such tactics, it is no surprise that the Mongols were able to snowball through Asia, creating the world's largest empire. Stories of Mongol atrocities preceded the hordes of warriors pouring out of Central Asia. From Iraq to China, those in the way of Mongol expansion commonly chose subservience to Mongol overlords rather than face the wrath of the Khan. The Muslim state that touched the borders of the Mongol Empire was the Khwarezmiya Empire. This empire picked up many of the pieces left by the demise of the Seljuk Empire, uniting most of Persia under the rule of Shah Muhammad r. 1200-1220, a man with Turkic ancestry but raised in Persian court culture. During his reign, the Abbasid caliphs, who had been essentially powerless since the mid-10th century, began to exert more direct authority. The Caliph al-Nasir was the first Abbasid to lead an army out of Baghdad in centuries, as he consolidated most of Iraq and parts of Persia under his rule. Shah Muhammad was not ready to accept a caliphate with real sovereignty just as he was expanding his own power throughout the Muslim world. Naturally, this meant conflict between the caliph's young state and the Khwarezmiya Empire of Muhammad. Perhaps it was because of this conflict, or perhaps it was Muhammad's over-reliance on overworked slave soldiers. But the Khwarezmiyas were not prepared when Genghis Khan, and his fearsome warriors arrived on the Muslim frontier in 1219. The Khwarezmias, however, decided to pick a fight with the Mongols. When merchants from the Mongol Empire entered the Khwarezmia domain, they were put to death as spies. Needless to say, Genghis Khan was less than pleased with this development, especially since he seems to have desired peaceful relations with the Muslim state. He swore vengeance, and the next year Mongol armies arrived in Muslim lands for the first time, beginning a period of destruction for Muslim civilization in Persia, Iraq and Syria. The Mongols combined their superior fighting ability with siege engines brought in from China to quickly conquer the major cities of eastern Persia. Bukhara, the city forever associated with the great Hadith compilation of Al-Bukhari, was completely destroyed. Ancient Balkh came to a similar fate, and its library of thousands of manuscripts was dumped into the Oxus River. The Mongol drive had no use for books or the academic achievements of Muslim civilization. They were nomadic warriors, and their only business was conquest and pillage. As they pushed into modern-day Iran and Afghanistan, some of the major urban centers were reduced to nothingness. Muslim historians of the era claim the Mongols massacred 1.7 million people in Nishapur and over 2 million people in Herat. These numbers may or may not be accurate, but what is clear is that the Mongols rained death and destruction wherever they went. Islamic civilization that had taken 600 years to build was being erased in a matter of weeks. The Khwarezmiya Empire was essentially destroyed by 1222 after a short but destructive conflict. Genghis Khan chose not to continue into the heart of the Muslim world. He retired back to Mongolia where he died in 1225. After the death of Genghis Khan, the Muslim world experienced a welcome reprieve from Mongol attacks. The new Khan, Genghis' son Ogedai, chose to focus on crossing the Ural Mountains and conquering Europe. The Mongols did this with incredible efficiency, as always, and in 1237, led their armies across modern-day Russia and into Hungary and Germany. Christian monarchs across Europe were terrified at the prospect of these heathen Mongols decimating their land as they did to the Khwarezmiya domain. Yet just as the Mongol incursion into Muslim lands ended abruptly, the Mongols abandoned their campaigns in Europe in 1241 when Ogedai died. At this point, Christian Europe was still very much enchanted with the idea of crusading into the Holy Land and reconquering Jerusalem. The Ayyubids, however, still had the requisite power and ability to resist attempts on the Holy City. If Christian Europe wanted to re-establish itself in Palestine, it needed help. Luckily for them, an alliance with the Mongols became more of a possibility as Nestorian Christianity slowly crept into the upper echelons of the Mongol Empire, especially since many of Genghis' descendants had married Christian women. After repeated embassies sent by European monarchs requesting a Mongol invasion into Muslim lands, the Mongols finally mobilized an army with the aim of completely obliterating Islamic political power in 1255. Truly, the day of judgment has been held in Baghdad. The family of the Prophet and the household of learning have been taken captive, and whom, think you, after their loss, will cities contain? Ismail bin Abil Yusra, a contemporary poet. The leader of this Mongol army was Hulgu, a man whose stance against Islam was clearly influenced by his Christian and Buddhist advisors. The army was probably the largest the Mongols ever fielded, over 100,000 strong. Troops from Christian Armenia and the remaining Crusader states also joined in. The Muslim world was ill-prepared for such an onslaught. The Khwarezmiya Empire was dispersed and greatly weakened by the initial Mongol invasion 30 years before. The Abbasid Caliphate barely controlled Iraq and was in constant struggle with the Hashashin sect for power. Meanwhile, the Ayyubid dynasty of Saladin's descendants was overthrown in 1250 by its own slave soldiers, known as Mamluks, who established the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. Once again, a disunited and weak Muslim world faced an invasion from a foreign land, and once again, disaster would ensue. In 922, the Muslim traveler and jurist bin Fadlan wrote the earliest existing record of the Vikings. The Mongols swept into Persia, where they made an overwhelming assault on the Hashashin. Their stronghold of Almut, which had for so long eluded conquest by Sunnis, was destroyed by Hulgu in 1256. Before Sunnis could cheer the final downfall of the Hashashin, however, Hulgu set his sights on Baghdad, which had been the capital of the Caliphate since 750. The Caliph al-Mustasim refused to surrender and accept Mongol authority. Never before in Islamic history had the Caliphate itself fallen, or had the capital been taken. Even in the face of Fatimid and Crusader invasion, circumstances had always worked out in a way that the spiritual leadership of the Muslim world was spared. Perhaps this history had caused al-Mustasim and others in Baghdad to hope that something similar would happen when the Mongols came in 1258. This time, however, no miraculous victory came. No great alliance of Muslim states was forged to defend the Caliphate, and no amount of individual bravery in the face of Mongol aggression could save the city. After a siege of just a week, Hulgu's army captured the capital of the Caliphate on 10 February 1258. The conquest of Baghdad was one of the most devastating events in Islamic history. The usual Mongol massacre soon followed the city's fall. Its entire Muslim population, with estimates ranging from 200,000 to 1 million, was killed. Only the city's Christian community was spared. The ancient house of wisdom that was established by Al-Mamun to push scientific learning to new frontiers was razed to the ground. Its books were dumped into the Tigris River, the ink from hundreds of years of scholarship turning the river black. Thousands of works on math, science, geography, history, theology and jurisprudence were lost forever. Such was this loss that today we only have a fraction of the works of the great scientists of the Golden Age such as Bin al-Haytham, al-Biruni and Bin Sina. What other discoveries they may have had that we are unaware of bled into the Tigris, never to be read again. As hundreds of years of knowledge was being destroyed, the Caliph himself was taken by Hulgu, wrapped in one of his luxurious carpets, and trampled to death by Mongol horsemen. The Abbasid Caliphate would have ceased to exist had another member of the Abbasid family not been installed in Cairo as Caliph soon after the massacre. The Abbasid Caliphate in Egypt lasted until 1517 under Mamluk authority, but the Caliphs were nothing more than figureheads who never again held real power. The destruction of Baghdad was more than the conquest of a city. It was the end of a political, scientific, and religious center that the Muslim world at that time never could have conceived of. The Mongols, of course, had no intention of stopping at Baghdad. Hulgu continued his advance into Syria. Aleppo and Damascus were taken, much to the delight of Christians in the region, especially the Crusaders. A Christian mass was held in the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus, once the largest and grandest mosque in the world. It would seem that nothing was going to stop the Mongols from moving south into Egypt, destroying Islamic civilization there, and effectively erasing Islam from the world just as fast as it rose 600 years before. But that was not to be. The young Mamluk Sultanate halted the Mongol advance in 1260 in northern Palestine. Sultan Baybars led the Mamluks in a pitched battle where he used the Mongols' own cavalry tactics against them, leading to the first Mongol defeat since they arrived in Muslim lands. The victory meant Egypt, and perhaps Islam itself, was saved from Mongol atrocities. Follow-up invasions were also futile, especially since a Mongol Khan in Russia, Berk, had converted to Islam and allied with the Mamluks against Hulgu. This Mongol civil war between the Muslim Berk and the pagan Hulgu meant a temporary reprieve for the Muslim world. Furthermore, in the late 1200s, as the entire Mongol Empire was divided into separate states and expansion was halted. Islamic civilization survived the Mongol assault, but only a shadow of the former glory of the Islamic world remained. Persia and Iraq were essentially destroyed politically. Syria was ravaged by warfare. The holy cities of Mecca and Medina had only narrowly avoided capture by pagans. For Muslims, it was one of the worst times in Islamic history. Some even lamented that the end of the world must be near. As a result of the destruction of the 13th century, serious theological questions arose. Muslims of the era had trouble reconciling their belief that Islam is the perfect religion with the destruction that had befallen it. The Caliphate, the special institution that was inaugurated by Abu Bakr after the death of the Prophet, was no more. Millions of Muslim souls perished under the swords of the invaders, and worst of all, the Mongols were overwhelmingly heathen pagans. They were not even people of the book. For Islam to come to such a fate at the hands of the Mongols was problematic. Some began to wonder if there was something wrong with Islam. Muslim theologians rose to combat this idea, led by Bin Taymiyyah. He argued that there was never anything wrong with Islam. The problem, according to him, was that Muslims digressed from the correct practice of it, and that the Mongol disaster was a result of Muslims losing their way. Much like Al-Dajjali 200 years before him, he sought to purge Islam from what he saw as innovations that ran contrary to the example of Muhammad. Although he was a Sufi, he denounced the excessive mystical philosophy of some Sufi branches, believing that they ultimately led to polytheism. At the same time, he rejected the legitimacy of Muslim leaders who did not uphold Islamic law and conduct themselves in an Islamic fashion. This brought him into inevitable conflict with both Mongol and Mamluk rulers, leading to numerous imprisonments and eventual death in the citadel of Damascus. His ideas helped spawn hope for many in the Muslim world that if they simply adhered to a pure and unaltered version of Islam, they could once again rise up to become world dominators. Islamic civilization would in fact experience a rebirth, but not in the traditional heartland of Islam between the Nile and Oxus rivers. Instead, this rebirth began in the northwest frontier of the Muslim world, where the nomadic warrior society of the Turks clashed with the established and urban Byzantine Empire.